The moment an avoidant begins to feel something real, their behavior often changes in ways that seem confusing from the outside. One day they appear emotionally present, engaged, even deeply connected. Then suddenly they become distant, harder to reach, slower to respond, less expressive. Most people interpret this shift as rejection or loss of interest, but in many cases, the deeper reality is far more complex. What you are witnessing is not the absence of feeling, it is the activation of fear. An avoidant person rarely fears casual interaction. Surface-level connection feels manageable because it does not require deep emotional exposure or dependence. There is little risk in conversations that remain light, controlled, and emotionally safe. But once the connection begins carrying emotional weight, once vulnerability, intimacy, and genuine attachment enter the picture, something inside them becomes unsettled.
Because now they are no longer simply enjoying someone's company. Now they are being emotionally seen. They are becoming emotionally known. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional self-protection, that level of closeness can feel deeply threatening. So they begin to create space. Sometimes the shift is obvious. Other times it is subtle and difficult to explain. They take longer to reply. Their emotional warmth becomes inconsistent. They distract themselves with work, hobbies, or other priorities. They suddenly question the relationship or convince themselves that something feels off. But these reactions are not random. They are defensive responses designed to reduce internal discomfort. Distance becomes a way to regain emotional control when closeness starts feeling overwhelming. And this is the paradox many people struggle to understand. The stronger the emotional connection becomes, the stronger the avoidance instinct to retreat can become as well. From the outside, this appears contradictory. How can someone move closer emotionally and then suddenly withdraw? The answer lies in understanding that avoidant individuals often associate intimacy with emotional danger. The thing they long for connection is also the thing their nervous system has learned to fear. Closeness can unconsciously represent loss of independence, emotional overwhelm, vulnerability, rejection, or the possibility of being consumed by another person's needs and expectations. So when a relationship begins feeling emotionally significant, their internal alarm system activates. This does not mean you should excuse inconsistency or ignore unhealthy behavior, but it does mean you should interpret it accurately. Because if you mistake fear for indifference, you will likely respond in ways that intensify the cycle. You may start chasing reassurance, over-explaining yourself, proving your worth, or trying to force clarity. And ironically, that pressure often increases the avoidance need for distance because it confirms the very overwhelm they are trying to escape. What is required instead is awareness. You have to recognize that their withdrawal is not necessarily evidence that the connection meant nothing. In many cases, it means the connection mattered enough to trigger their defenses. Once you understand this, you stop personalizing every emotional shift. You stop treating every moment of distance as a reflection of your value. Instead, you begin to see the larger psychological pattern underneath the behavior. People rarely run from what feels emotionally meaningless. They run from what has the power to affect them deeply. For an avoidant person, emotional impact can feel destabilizing because it threatens the protective systems they spent years building. Their independence, emotional restraint, and self-sufficiency are not just personality traits, they are survival strategies. Deep connection challenges those strategies. It asks them to lower defenses that once made them feel safe. And that creates intense internal tension. Some people resolve tension by leaning closer. Avoidants resolve it by pulling away. Once you begin understanding that initial withdrawal, another layer of confusion often appears: mixed signals. One moment they seem fully invested. The next they feel emotionally unavailable. Their behavior fluctuates between closeness and distance, warmth and detachment, engagement and silence. Without psychological understanding, this inconsistency can feel emotionally destabilizing. But mixed signals are rarely random. They are usually evidence of internal conflict. Inside the avoidant person, two opposing drives exist simultaneously. One side genuinely wants connection, intimacy, understanding, and closeness. That desire is real. They enjoy emotional connection when it feels safe enough. But at the same time, another part of them fears the consequences of that same closeness. Emotional intimacy activates fears of dependency, vulnerability, rejection, and loss of control. This creates oscillation. They move closer when the desire for connection feels stronger than the fear. They pull away when emotional intensity starts feeling overwhelming. They engage deeply when they feel emotionally safe. They detach when vulnerability begins feeling too real. Because these shifts are happening internally, often without full conscious awareness, their external behavior becomes inconsistent. To the other person, it feels confusing and unpredictable. To the avoidant, it feels like emotional self-protection. And psychologically, inconsistency has a powerful effect on people. Human beings naturally seek stability. Consistency creates emotional safety because it allows the mind to relax. But inconsistency creates uncertainty, and uncertainty captures attention. When someone alternates between closeness and distance, your mind begins searching for explanations. You analyze their behavior, you question yourself, you replay conversations trying to identify what changed. Without realizing it, you become emotionally attached to solving the uncertainty itself. That is why mixed signals feel so addictive. They provide enough connection to keep hope alive, but not enough stability to create peace. But here is the deeper truth you must recognize. This is not a stable person expressing unstable interest. This is an internally divided person expressing both fear and desire at the same time. And if you respond to that instability emotionally by chasing, overinvesting, or trying to earn consistency through effort, you unintentionally reinforce the pattern. Your increased emotional investment allows them to remain emotionally unregulated while still keeping the connection intact. This is why emotional awareness matters so deeply. Mixed signals are information. They reveal that the person is not internally aligned, and someone who is internally divided cannot consistently offer emotional stability, no matter how genuine their feelings may be in certain moments. That does not automatically make them manipulative or uncaring. In many cases, it simply means they are emotionally unprepared for the level of intimacy the connection requires. And this is where your own clarity becomes essential. You cannot build emotional security by endlessly trying to decode someone else's inconsistency. At some point, the focus has to return to you. Your peace cannot depend on whether someone is temporarily leaning in or pulling away. Your self-worth cannot rise and fall based on their emotional regulation. Understanding avoidant behavior is important, but understanding yourself is even more important, because the goal is not to chase emotional certainty from someone who is still struggling with closeness. The goal is to remain grounded enough that another person's fear does not pull you out of alignment with yourself. Once you reach that point, everything changes. You stop reacting impulsively to distance. You stop trying to control every emotional shift. You stop treating inconsistency as something you must solve. Instead, you begin observing clearly. You recognize patterns without becoming consumed by them. You understand their behavior psychologically without abandoning your own emotional standards. And that is where real power begins. Not in forcing closeness, not in convincing someone to stay, but in maintaining your own clarity, stability, and self-respect while deciding whether the connection truly meets you in a healthy way. And this is the moment where your power begins to return, because you no longer feel the need to analyze every emotional shift they make. You stop chasing certainty from someone who is still uncertain within themselves. Instead, you begin anchoring yourself in a different standard, the understanding that consistency is not something you beg for, negotiate for, or slowly convince someone to give you. It is something that naturally reveals itself when a person is emotionally available and internally aligned. At a deeper level, mixed signals only control you when you abandon your own need for clarity in exchange for emotional intensity. That is the trap many people fall into. They become attached to the emotional highs, the moments of closeness, the flashes of vulnerability, the brief periods where everything feels meaningful again. And because those moments feel real, they start overlooking the inconsistency surrounding them. But you have to ask yourself an important question. Are you responding to who this person is consistently, or are you reacting to who they become occasionally? Because those are not the same relationship. One is built on stable reality. The other is built on temporary emotional experiences. And once you recognize that difference clearly, your entire perspective changes. You stop being emotionally pulled back and forth by their unpredictability. You stop making every moment of distance feel like a mystery you need to solve. Instead, you begin observing the pattern with calm awareness rather than emotional urgency. The question shifts from, why are they like this, to, what am I willing to keep accepting? That shift matters because the inconsistency itself is not what keeps people trapped. It is the meaning they attach to it. Once you stop confusing emotional unpredictability with emotional depth, you stop investing yourself into confusion and start prioritizing clarity instead. And as you begin recognizing the pattern beneath their inconsistency, another layer becomes impossible to ignore. It is not just that they struggle with consistency, it is that they consistently avoid emotional depth. This is where many people start feeling an invisible disconnect they cannot fully explain. Everything may appear functional on the surface. There are conversations, affection, moments of closeness, shared experiences, but whenever the relationship begins moving toward deeper emotional territory, something changes. The energy tightens. Conversations become shorter, more detached, or strangely intellectualized. They avoid speaking directly about feelings, needs, fears, expectations, or the future. Sometimes they deflect with humor. Sometimes they change the topic entirely. Other times they simply go emotionally silent. On the surface, this can feel dismissive or uncaring, but psychologically, what you are witnessing is not a lack of feeling. It is discomfort with emotional exposure. Because meaningful emotional conversations require something that avoidants struggle deeply with presence without protection. They require honesty without control. They require someone to remain emotionally open while being fully seen. And for someone who has spent years protecting themselves through emotional distance, that level of vulnerability can feel overwhelming. What many people fail to realize is that avoidants often feel emotions very deeply. The issue is not the absence of emotion. The issue is the way they learn to manage it. Instead of expressing emotions outwardly, they process everything internally. They self-regulate alone. They cope alone. They retreat inward whenever emotions become too intense. Over time, this becomes part of their identity. I handle things myself. I do not rely on others emotionally. So, when you invite them into deeper emotional connection, it challenges that entire system. It asks them to verbalize emotions they are used to suppressing. It asks them to sit in vulnerability instead of escaping it. And most importantly, it asks them to trust that emotional openness will not lead to rejection, criticism, overwhelm, or loss of control. If their past taught them that vulnerability leads to pain, then their instinct will always be to avoid emotional exposure whenever possible. So they stay near the surface, not because they lack emotional depth, but because emotional depth feels unsafe to sustain. And this is where things become important for you to understand clearly. When someone consistently avoids emotional depth, it creates more than just communication problems. It creates a limitation in the relationship itself. Because real intimacy is not built only through chemistry, attraction, or shared experiences. Real intimacy is built through emotional transparency, through the ability to say, this is what I feel, this is what I need, this is who I am, and have that met openly by another person. Without that exchange, the relationship eventually reaches a ceiling. It may still contain affection, it may still contain moments of connection, but it cannot fully deepen because emotional safety is never fully established. And this is where many people unknowingly exhaust themselves. They try harder. They initiate deeper conversations repeatedly. They create safer environments. They search for the perfect questions, the perfect timing, the perfect emotional approach that will finally make the other person open up. But emotional depth cannot be forced into existence through effort alone. You cannot create emotional availability for someone who is still emotionally avoiding themselves. That does not mean they are incapable of growth, but it does mean your effort alone cannot bridge a gap that they themselves are unwilling or unable to cross internally. So the shift for you is not about trying harder, it is about seeing more clearly. You begin recognizing that their emotional avoidance is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their current emotional capacity. Their silence is not always rejection. Their emotional distance is not always lack of care. Sometimes it is limitation. And once you see that clearly, something changes within you. You stop personalizing the lack of depth. You stop chasing conversations that never fully happen. You stop trying to pull emotional openness out of someone who resists it internally. Instead, you begin asking a different question. Are they truly capable of meeting me where I already stand emotionally? Because a relationship can never grow beyond the level of honesty both people are willing to sustain. It will always stop at the point where one person refuses to go deeper. And once you realize that, you stop focusing on how to make them open up. You start focusing on whether you are willing to remain inside a connection where emotional depth is consistently avoided. That awareness changes everything, because now you stop investing in potential alone. You stop building relationships around isolated moments of closeness while ignoring the overall pattern. You begin valuing mutual emotional presence over temporary emotional intensity. And then another paradox reveals itself. You notice that the avoidant often pulls away most strongly right after moments of genuine intimacy, right after meaningful conversations, right after vulnerability, right after emotional closeness, right after connection finally feels real. For a brief moment, everything feels grounded, secure, mutual. Then suddenly they retreat. If you interpret this emotionally, it feels deeply confusing. It can make you question whether the intimacy was genuine at all, but psychologically, the pattern makes perfect sense. Because intimacy does not only create connection for an avoidant, it creates activation. The moment they feel emotionally exposed, their nervous system registers vulnerability. Vulnerability signals emotional risk, and emotional risk activates fear. So, the withdrawal that follows intimacy is often not a rejection of the connection itself. It is an attempt to regulate the intensity of it. Their system can tolerate closeness only up to a certain threshold. Once that emotional threshold is crossed, they instinctively create distance to regain internal control. And if you do not understand this pattern, you start doubting the very moments that were actually real. You assume the closeness meant nothing. You search for mistakes. You overanalyze your own behavior. But the pattern is much simpler than it appears. Closeness activates fear. Fear creates distance. That is the cycle. And if every moment of intimacy is followed by withdrawal, the relationship never fully stabilizes. It becomes cyclical instead of secure. It rises, falls, reconnects, disconnects, then repeats. Over time, that cycle becomes emotionally exhausting because the relationship never fully settles into consistency. This is why the most important shift you can make is learning to evaluate patterns instead of isolated moments. You stop measuring love by intensity alone. You stop building hope around temporary closeness. You start asking whether the connection is sustainable over time. Because real intimacy is not just about reaching emotional depth occasionally, it is about being able to remain present inside that depth consistently. And if someone can only offer closeness temporarily before retreating from it, then what you have is not stable emotional intimacy. It is intermittent connection. At some point, you have to decide whether intermittent connection is enough for you. Because real love does not require you to constantly recover from closeness disappearing. Real love creates stability, openness, and emotional continuity over time. And once you truly understand that, your focus shifts completely. You stop chasing moments, you start recognizing patterns. You stop trying to unlock emotionally unavailable people. You start choosing relationships where emotional presence already exists naturally. Because connection without emotional openness may feel intense at times, but intensity alone cannot sustain a relationship. Only consistency can. What makes an avoidant pull away is rarely a lack of feeling. In many cases, it is the exact opposite. The closer the connection becomes, the more emotionally real it feels to them, and that reality activates fear. Most people misunderstand this completely because they judge the behavior only from the outside. They see distance and assume disinterest. They see withdrawal and assume the connection meant nothing. But psychologically, something much deeper is happening beneath the surface. For an avoidant, casual connection feels manageable because it does not threaten their sense of control. Light conversation, surface attraction, and emotional independence feel safe. There is no pressure to depend on another person, no fear of losing themselves inside intimacy. But the moment the relationship begins to carry emotional weight, something changes internally. When conversations become meaningful, when vulnerability starts forming, when they realize the bond could genuinely matter, their nervous system begins associating closeness with danger rather than comfort. That is why they suddenly create distance right when things seem to be progressing. Sometimes the shift is obvious, other times it is subtle. Replies become slower. Their emotional energy changes. They seem distracted, less expressive, less certain. In some cases, they even begin convincing themselves that something is wrong with the relationship or with you. But these reactions are usually not random. They are attempts to regulate emotional discomfort that feels overwhelming to them. This is the paradox most people struggle to understand. The stronger the connection feels, the stronger the urge to retreat can become. From the outside, this behavior looks contradictory. How can someone move closer emotionally and then suddenly pull away? The answer is that closeness and fear are intertwined inside the avoidant mind. The very thing they long for connection is also the thing they unconsciously associate with emotional overwhelm, rejection, dependency, or loss of control. If someone has spent years protecting themselves through emotional independence, intimacy will naturally feel destabilizing. Deep connection challenges the emotional defenses they built to survive. It asks them to lower the walls that once made them feel safe. That creates internal tension, and people respond to tension differently. Some move closer. Avoidance creates space. This does not mean their behavior should be excused or endlessly tolerated. Emotional inconsistency still affects relationships, but understanding the psychology behind it changes how you interpret it. When you mistake fear for indifference, you begin reacting emotionally. You chase, you over-explain, you try to prove your value, and ironically, those reactions often increase the avoidant's urge to withdraw even further, because pressure intensifies their fear of emotional engulfment. What matters is recognizing the pattern clearly. Their withdrawal is often not evidence that the connection lacked meaning. In many cases, it is proof that the connection became emotionally significant enough to activate their defenses. People rarely run from what means nothing to them. They run from what affects them deeply enough to make them feel emotionally vulnerable. Once you understand that, something inside you shifts. You stop personalizing every moment of distance. You stop treating every emotional fluctuation like a verdict on your worth. Instead, you begin observing the behavior psychologically rather than reacting impulsively to it. That awareness keeps you grounded. Then another layer appears: the inconsistency. One moment they are deeply engaged, emotionally present, affectionate, and connected. The next they feel unavailable, distracted, distant, or emotionally detached. This inconsistency confuses people because it creates emotional instability. But mixed signals are rarely random. They are usually the visible expression of an internal conflict. Inside the avoidant person, two forces are constantly competing. One side genuinely wants connection, closeness, understanding, and intimacy. The other side fears what intimacy represents. Emotional exposure, dependence, vulnerability, loss of autonomy. So their nervous system oscillates between desire and fear. They move closer when connection feels safe. They pull away when it begins to feel emotionally overwhelming. That creates the push-pull dynamic many people become trapped inside. They show warmth and closeness just enough to create emotional investment, then withdraw before stability fully forms. And because humans naturally seek clarity and consistency, the inconsistency itself becomes psychologically gripping. You start analyzing every interaction, searching for explanations. waiting for the emotionally available version of them to return. But mixed signals do not mean depth. They mean internal division. And this is where your clarity becomes essential. You do not need to decode every emotional shift from someone who is unclear within themselves. You need to recognize that inconsistency is information. It reveals that the person is not internally aligned enough to sustain stable connection. That does not make them evil or manipulative. It simply means they are emotionally unprepared for the kind of relationship they may genuinely desire. The deeper issue appears when emotional depth enters the relationship. Surface interaction is manageable for avoidance because it keeps vulnerability limited. But once conversations move into feelings, needs, expectations, fears, or future plans, many avoidants begin shutting down internally. Their responses become vague, intellectualized, avoidant, or emotionally distant. This often gets mistaken for emotional emptiness, but many avoidants actually feel emotions intensely. The problem is not feeling, the problem is expression and vulnerability. They learn to process emotions privately rather than relationally. They regulate themselves alone. Over time, that becomes part of their identity. I handle things myself. So when emotional intimacy requires openness, honesty, and shared vulnerability, it challenges their entire coping structure. It asks them to trust another person with parts of themselves they normally keep hidden. And if vulnerability has historically been associated with pain, criticism, rejection, or emotional overwhelm, avoidance becomes their instinctive defense. This creates a painful limitation inside the relationship. The connection may feel meaningful in moments, but it struggles to deepen consistently because emotional openness is continually interrupted. And many people respond to this by trying harder. They initiate more conversations, create safer environments, ask deeper questions, hoping the avoidant will eventually open fully.